Well, I do have a couple more questions if you have
Sure.
a moment from listeners.
Yeah.
Coleman asked, he has
Wait, who asked this? I missed what you said.
sorry, this is Coleman,
Coleman.
the
Okay.
pastor, the Swedenborgian. So he said, and I think he just put this as a fragment following up his question about Jesus's parables, and their clarity or the delay in comprehension. He said less idiosyncratic, the relationship between religious poetry that is designed to be part of. And here I can't tell if this is his typo or mine when I transcribed it, but I have worship. I assume this is supposed to be worship, and
Yeah,
that
I
might have been
imagine.
my. But I also kind of like worship as the it's like the thing that happens in religious practice. So
Yeah.
he says that the relationship between religious poetry that is designed to be part of worship, and he gives the examples of Wilbur's Christmas hymn and a lot of Malcolm Guite's sonnets. I don't know Guite,
Me
versus
neither.
religious poetry that is more probing and open-ended. And he points to your work, Christian Wyman's work, and Jeffrey Hill's.
And
Yeah.
that's it, just that fragment, that's the thing.
Yeah, so I think the question is like, what do you make of the relationship or lack of the relationship between religious poetry that's supposed to be part of worship and religious poetry that it maybe exists outside of worship and is, he describes it as being probing and open-ended, and I can
Right.
imagine different ways of thinking about that. I didn't know Wilbur's Christmas hymn, so I read it just today, and it has the kind of motion or non-motion that I do associate with hymns from the lyrics of hymns
Mhm,
from
mhm.
church. It doesn't it's not a it's not a lyric with a volta so much as it's a very beautiful and well composed kind of declaration or reflection.
Well, I would say I don't know that I'm qualified to give a good answer to this, partly because this is going to sound so terrible. I don't know. I am not really interested in poetry as part of worship.
Hmm.
When I am worship for me is worship, and I'm not,
Yeah.
I'm not necessarily thinking about those other aspects. I wouldn't, really think of it in a literary way, in the same way that I would think of it if I were just to encounter it in a book,
Yeah.
as I'm going about my daily life. And so there's a way in which I don't have much interest in it. And I certainly don't think about it. I don't really encounter it as a poet, or as a lover of poetry. And so, or maybe that is the answer. That's just, I don't really engage with it in that way. I would have to be pretty far removed from the worship context in order for me to really think about it as poetry. And I don't even know if I could, because I understand that it's a kind of utilitarian thing. It's meant to serve a particular function
Yeah.
in a way that's different from the function that poems that are more open and probing are meant to serve.
So in my extremely fragmentary and incomplete religious education, I remember being taught that Muhammad makes a challenge. Well, I mean, I get, arguably he's not making the challenge, but the Quran itself, the uncreated text, is making the challenge to the reader to this specifically. There's this call that says basically like, to all of you poets out there, try to write the way that this book is written,
Mm-hmm.
because you will fail, but your failure in attempting to replicate this will be a further demonstration of the kind of the greatness and truth of this text. And
Mm-hmm.
it's always struck me as like a simultaneously kind of thrilling and crazy challenge. Like it seems like both, like on the one hand it seems like, oh, what, like how interesting to kind of like to have this invitation to poets as part of the the textual tradition of the faith. And on the other hand, like, well, of course it's not going to work for a number of reasons, some of which are very, like, some of which have nothing to do with like literary beauty
Mm-hmm.
or like cosmic truth. But yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Yes, okay, yeah.
I was a Muslim for some years,
Oh,
and so
were you?
yes, I'm
Okay, well then
truly
you, yeah,
yes.
so I may be talking, I'm this is my like, you know partial memory from college studies. So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
you may know much better than I do about it, about this.
Well, that So from a Muslim perspective, it would be incorrect to say that Muhammad makes that challenge, at least in the context of the Quran,
Yes, yeah,
because
yeah,
the
yeah.
Quran
He's just
itself,
the mouthpiece for the
yeah, the Quran itself, it's in there. Yeah, this idea. I mean, the Quran is a very, it's hard to talk about it in a literary sense. But if you think about it in those terms, it's a very kind of shocking text with regard to its structure, etc. When you consider when it came out, because it's very when it came out, when you consider when it appeared, when it came to be, it's
Mhm.
very fragmentary. It reads as a kind of very post, kind of like a post Joycean
Hmm.
a text. It builds. It's very coherent, but it's also like it reads almost like you took a relatively straightforward book and then you shattered it into a bunch of different pieces and then you glued them back together without necessarily trying to reproduce the original. It's really something. It is radically unlike, the Hebrew and Christian scriptures, for example, and that radical difference is part of why it would be, why it would seem to be impossible for, the poets of the time or any poet to sort of produce something like it. It
Yeah.
is so unlike other books, particularly other books that existed at the time.
Yeah.
It was, I can't think, I suspect there was no other book like it when it
Mhm.
was first sort of codified. Um, and so, yeah, I can understand that challenge.
And my recollection was that taking an historical perspective for a moment, the verses of it, were set down out of order and sort of achieved their order in like under Muhammad's instruction, but in retrospect, like it was not like he just said it all in order. I was taught that he was sort of he said some of the passages that appeared early were appear late in the Quran and vice versa.
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
it's not in chronological order. It's roughly speaking in order of length. Like the longer sections are the early sections. Not, it doesn't perfectly align with that, but roughly that's the order
Whoa,
it's
that's
in.
wild.
Yeah,
That's like Stallings arranging her selected in alphabetical order. You're like, what?
yeah, yeah. It's just with the exception of the first surah, which is sort of like the Muslim equivalent to the Lord's Prayer. They
Okay.
start out really, really long and then get shorter as it goes.
All right. Coleman asked and answered. Um, Ethan also has sort of a complicated question. He says, Shane tweeted a while back, but I don't remember when, that he would like to write an essay about why he crafts his
Mm,
poems the way he does. I don't know if he ever wrote that
yes.
essay, but I hope he talks a little bit with you about it. His poems certainly seem striking and unique to me. The way he uses enjambment, white space stanzas, indentation, etc. I find it exciting, but I'm also often left puzzled as to why. What is his reasoning behind creating poems that way? What does he consider his poetic style and aesthetics, and how does he hope readers receive his poems?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. It relates to something that we were talking about earlier, this whole idea of does one get worse as one goes along? And one of the
Mm,
things that I would have said at the time, I thought about saying but didn't, was that it also helps to not have a fully realized conception of what it is that one is doing. I think that you can understand what you're doing in sort of broad strokes,
mm,
but it's good not to have a project with an end and say,
yeah.
okay, I'm trying to write a poem that sounds like this. And when I write this poem, I will have achieved what it is that I'm trying to do. And so I can only say so much, but partly my poems started to sound the way that they do as the result of something that felt to me like a necessity. I was writing when I got my MFA, and for about a year thereafter, well, half a year. I was writing these free verse, very heavily punctuated, very conventional for the time. This being 2004 when I got my MFA, poems. They were kind of funny. They were early 2000s free verse poems, very, very common. The impression I got from conversations with people who mean a lot to me and meant a lot to me then were that people didn't really like them very much. I think people understood that they recognized that they were competent in some way. And I didn't like them very much. I was very unhappy, and the poems were just, I think, expressions of being very unhappy, but there wasn't really anything to recommend them, except for that they were kind of funny sometimes. Yeah, I felt like what I was writing wasn't satisfying me at all, and
Yeah.
it was not of any use to anybody else. And so I really felt like I had to make a change, and it couldn't be a small change. And so I just sort of started doing the opposite of what I had been doing. I stopped doing free verse. I got rid of the punctuation. I made everything double spaced because I wasn't doing that before. I
Mhm.
changed my syntax so that it wasn't straightforward. And the poems that ended up being the poems in my first book emerged from this idea that I'm just going to reverse everything. And immediately I felt like I was writing in a way that was more natural, even though to get there, it was a fairly contrived thing.
Sure.
It felt like, oh, this is the way that I'm meant to be writing. And suddenly I was writing much more, you know, two or so poems a day when I had the time. It was just, they were kind of flowing out. It felt like what I should be doing.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't the result of doing some sort of poetical theorizing. You know, it wasn't the result of thinking, okay, this is what a poem should be and everybody should be doing this. It was the result of thinking, I need to change what I'm doing. And it, you know, why not? I can understand the opposite of what I'm already doing. So why not try to do the opposite? That's what started it. I have thought about it since.
Yeah.
Like, what is it that's happening? What does it seem to be that I'm trying to do? I like my sometimes unusual syntax and repetition because they allow me freedom within the context of what is otherwise a fairly strict formality. You know, you reading a poem by poet X from the 19th century or whatever, you will, you know, particularly if they're not an especially competent poem, but even Yeats does, or poet, but even Yeats does this sometimes. And not only in his work from the late 19th century, you will sometimes encounter like syntactical reversals to make a rhyme work, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Sure.
And I thought, I'm certainly not as good a poet as these poets who are doing this, but if I need to make a rhyme work, I don't want it to be obvious that I'm forcing the rhyme.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
so I created a syntax or utilized the syntax that allowed me the freedom to get to where I needed to be at the end of the line
Ah.
without it
Okay.
feeling really unnatural to the reader. The syntax was strange and disruptive anyway.
Right.
And repetition kind of sometimes achieves the same effect. It helps me
Yeah. Yeah.
deal
Yeah.
with metrical stuff, but I wanted to develop a style where that wouldn't feel unnatural. And so
Oh.
that's why they sound the way they've sounded. And I don't need to rely on that stuff so much anymore. And sometimes also, it's interesting. It's kind of like a feedback loop because I started doing that partly to give myself a little bit more wiggle room when I'm writing poems, but it fed back into the way I was thinking, and it would just be that I would naturally inclined to do some strange syntax, to do some repetition, just because I wanted to do them, not because I'm trying to satisfy some sort of metrical thing. You know, it started to feed back into the way I was thinking about poetry. I also felt like what was happening in what I was trying to do, particularly again at the level of syntax, sort of reflected a lot of the music that I really liked, where a lot of repetition, a lot of unusual but hopefully musical syntax sort of creates what I used to think of as a kind of haze of meaning, where it wasn't that I was necessarily making an argument that went from A to B and therefore C, but rather I was sort of creating this sort of cloud that in which the reader was enveloped, where everything that was happening in the cloud, all the lights going off or all the words or whatever, however you want to think of it, everything was connected, but it
Yeah.
wasn't necessarily that I was arguing the reader to some place. I was allowing them, you know, sounds much more grand than I'm sure I ever achieved, but I was hopefully allowing them to sort of occupy this space in which I still get them to where I want them to be, but it's a sort of ambient thing as opposed to like they're following a track there. They're inhabiting a cloud in which the thing that I want to happen is part of what's going on in the cloud. And it's part of when you leave the cloud, you leave the cloud with the thing that I
Yeah.
wanted you to leave with whatever meaning or whatever. But I'm not making an argument to get you there in the same way that a lot of poems do. And I thought that that was related to a lot of music that I liked, which was kind of dreamy, kind of hazy. I
Yeah.
was writing according to something like a dream logic, but it was rather that it was a logic meant to produce the kind of fuzzy, dreamy feeling. Um, and so I think that those are the kind of main reasons for why I was writing the kind of poetry that I was writing. I think it was derived both from my love of poetries that kind of occupy spaces that one at least used to call kind of avant-garde spaces, but also my love for really traditional poems and my love for, like I really like medieval lyrics, anonymous medieval lyrics, medieval song
Yeah.
lyrics.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was trying to write a poetry that brought together everything that I loved, and I happened to love the whole sweep of the tradition in English. And so it's really strictly metrical, and it's really, there are rules that I'm following that I'm very, very serious about.
Yeah.
But I have loosened a strict adherence to certain syntactical rules, certain grammatical rules, so that it will read, hopefully, it'll come across as poems that readers aren't necessarily familiar with, unless they're familiar with other poems I've written. They'll encounter it and think, oh, well, this doesn't necessarily sound like poet
Right.
X or poet Y. It's something hopefully kind of new, although I don't want to make, again, grand claims for whatever it is that I've tried to do, but something that's hopefully kind of new, but also not off putting. Like the way that I think about it, although he's a far superior artist to me than me, is, or to me, I don't know, whatever. The way that I kind of think about it is like if you listen to Steve Reich's music, it is, when you first hear it, it doesn't sound like anything
Yeah.
that you've heard, but it is immediately, you can immediately engage with it. You can immediately think, oh, this is beautiful. This
Yeah.
doesn't sound like Mozart, or this doesn't sound like Schumann or whatever,
Yeah.
but it's beautiful. And I get, it's still tonal, it's still doing things that make sense to me. But the way that he's arranged the parts is completely his own way. I was trying to do a kind of poetry that would have a sort of similar effect. It's both totally alien and very, very familiar. Hmm.
It reminds me of like something I've always found very familiar. I don't know if he's done it in his most recent books, but at least for a while, Colson Whitehead used to have a note at the end of his novels where he would say, like, it always felt like touchingly kind of vulnerable, but also just very like it struck a nerve where he would like name the albums he was listening to when he wrote that book. It was like I was
Sure.
listening to Bowie on repeat, and like I definitely have had similar experiences where like there was like even like a relatively short list of tracks I would play on repeat, writing certain things, and it makes me wonder if there's not a if some of that is not a version of the like the poetic tradition of intoxication. Like obviously, it's it is particularly over time like less and less productive to actually be intoxicated while composing, but like there is a kind of that things get shaken loose when you're in this sort of what you're talking this haze of music that in a way that maybe has some of the same properties without the same drawbacks to like Dionysian loss of self.
I think that that's probably true. I will say, um, I have never been intoxicated. I've never tried any kind of illegal drug, and I've had
Yeah.
1.5 bottles of Smirnoff Ice in my life, and I didn't have the first one until I was like 26.
Yeah.
I just never cared to, and now I'm like however many centuries old, and I'm like, well, why bother now? I just don't.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
interested.
I think that's probably
But
probably wise.
I think that that is related. I do like music that people seem to think of as like drug music or whatever, and
Sure.
so I think, yeah, I am trying to achieve something that I think is probably similar to that.
Yeah. Well, and the way you've talked about driving or playing certain immersive video games, it seems like there's a similar, like there's a thing that is being there's a mode of thought or non-thought that's permitted in a way in those
Yeah.
states that yeah.
So like I love Milton.
Mhm.
I love Sydney. I love a lot of poets who like I love a lot of 16th and 17th century poets. And I think, I don't want to abandon all of that stuff that they did. I don't want to abandon particularly rhyme and meter.
Mhm.
But I think the way that rhyme and meter has developed in English and the way people have developed, have used it, the development is very curious and strange because it's sort of like there are significant differences between somebody like Donne and Keats, right? But they're still very close in a lot of ways. And there's, rather a stretch of time between them. The development was so slow and so conservative. And I think, well, I have tried to make a kind of poetry that sounds like it was written in the 21st century, but it is still connected to these very long traditions. A kind of poetry that is not just a tiny step away from, whomever, but is rather admits of the possibility that art develops and changes. And sometimes it develops and changes in big ways that don't, it's like, when the second Viennese school happens, and the big break with tonality, they don't also stop using the orchestra. I want to still be using the instruments that have been used before, but I want to recognize that I want to find a way to make a kind of poetry that is contemporary and not alienating, and also connected with the poetry that came before it.
So there is a kind of criticism I've heard. It's a comment, I've heard with different X's and Y's filling in the slots a number of different times. And I always have the same response, which is on the one hand, like intuitively, I get it. And it feels, incriminating because any criticism I hear, I immediately apply to myself and find myself guilty. But then I also think like, I don't actually understand how that quite makes sense. And the criticism is,
Mm-hmm.
X is writing as if Y had never been written.
Mm-hmm.
Like, like you're writing as if the modernists had never appeared, like this sort of
Right.
criticism. And I have that two-sided response to it, but it seems like you're thinking about something in that neighborhood at least.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about, I don't want someone to say that about me, I
Right,
guess.
right, right.
Yeah. And maybe, well, okay. So how do I think about that? I think that I understand. Well, okay. I'll say a couple of different things about it. One, of course, it is impossible for a contemporary writer to write as if the modernists had never happened, because the
Sure.
modernists did in fact happen,
Yeah.
and there's nothing you can do about that. And so anybody who's writing, even if they're trying to sort of deny it and trying to write in a way that doesn't, you know, seem to be indebted to the modernists, they are still writing in a way that would, that happens after the modernists. So the modernists are in them, whether they like it or not. So you can't functionally write as if the modernists never happened.
Yeah.
But I guess, the way that I think about it, you know, strictly speaking, art doesn't progress. It changes forms. It changes approaches. But, there's great art from thousands of years ago, and there's great art from right now. What one is trying to do, I hope, or at least what I'm trying to do, is write in a form that is inflected with the history of the art, and trying not to exclude any major developments are part of that history. I'm trying to write as if the language poets happened.
Right.
I'm trying to write as if Flarf happened, even though I have basically no interest in Flarf.
Right.
I'm trying to write as if I am alive in the world, and whatever has happened in the last 30 years that I've been writing poetry, I have been aware of it as much as I can be. And I think that this is not a especially radical position. If you read, I keep mentioning Keats because I think about Keats a lot. If you read Keats's letters or whatever, he's poets around, have always been thinking about what's happening now,
Right.
and how do I be a part of whatever it is that's happening now, but also have been conscious of what happened before them, and how do they write a kind of poetry that somehow, how does Keats write a kind of poetry that expresses his love of Spencer? Or how does
Yeah.
Keats write a kind of poetry that expresses his love of Dante without just imitating Spencer, which he does do sometimes, or without just imitating Dante? I think that you get yourself in trouble when you, as a poet, say, well, I'm going to just try to write my way around the existence of HD or something. I'm going to
Oh
write
yeah,
poetry
yeah.
as if HD had never lived and had never written a poem, or
Right.
whomever, as if X movement had never happened.
Right.
Because what you end up doing is you end up approaching your art as an artist of pastiche. Now
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
you can love what you love, and you can write out of your own personal canon. Everybody has to make their own canon. But I think that you get into trouble. And again, I think that this is a trouble that a lot of new formalists got themselves into. You get yourself into trouble when you specifically write against some other kind of writing.
Oh yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and and the new formalists had a kind of dual engine driving them, where they loved X kind of poetry and they wanted to write a kind of poetry that reflected the thing they loved, but they also hated Y kind of poetry, and they wanted to write a kind of poetry that was contrary to Y kind, and then they ended up, you know, if you love X kind of poetry, you're putting barriers on the road, and those barriers can be very, they're running parallel with the road, and they can keep you from going off the road, and that's safe. But if you're also writing against Y kind of poetry, then instead of just having barriers, you've actually put a wall in front of you, so that you're not going down the highway anymore. You're in a box, and
Yeah.
then you end up writing a kind of poetry that can't live.
Yeah.
And so, I'm just trying to stay alive.
I mean totally makes sense, and it's funny because it almost is a like you're answering the question, and I mean this in like not connotative terms, but like technical terms. Like you've answered it in negatively, and that like here is how to like in order to write like an historically an anti-historical poem, you have like you're right. This is when you write against something, or you write with keeping something out in mind, and that does seem
Right.
to me like very obviously a pretty doomed undertaking. But I think at least my own experience, I tend to come at it from the other direction. That I get excited and inspired by all sorts of different stuff. Also, often like weird avant-garde art, or weird movies, or
Mm-hmm.
weird poems that I don't totally understand, but that they stir me, or they excite me, or they make me laugh, or they, something in. I even like before we started recording, you mentioned, I won't say the name, but you mentioned a poem that I think you called like the worst poem you've ever seen published by like a prominent poet in a significant
Mm-hmm.
magazine. While you were on the phone for a minute, I read it, and I do think it's quite. I think it's like I get your complaint. I do think it's bad, but also it seemed to me like it was bad in a way that like often I get excited by certain kinds of either flawed or trashy or whatever kind of art where like there's something that could have been good there. And
Sure.
like and to me I love that, because that says to me like, I see an opportunity.
Sure. Sure. Sure.
Like
Sure.
here's
Sure.
something I now want to write a the poem he should have written, right? Like that's
Yeah.
so, and so I get excited often by things I don't totally understand, or certainly don't endorse. But I think the problem for me in sitting down is almost it's the inverse of the problem you described, where like I I will often sit down thinking like, oh, I really liked that thing that happened in that funny poem I read, or like reading Bedart was great because I feel like I got excited about a bunch of stuff. I don't know what I think of his poems finally, but like I know enough that they like stirred some stuff in me, and that was great.
Mm.
And and like I hope that has an effect on how I write. I where I have trouble is in sitting down and saying like, well, I better keep in mind that the language, like I have trouble consciously incorporating the work of people that has not inspired me. right?
Oh, well, I don't like keep it in mind.
Right, but if you're
I
saying
just,
like even if like with Flarf, like you want to write as if Flarf happened, even though you don't find anything inspiring in Flarf. So then I
mhm.
guess my question is, well, how do you do that? Because that I find very difficult, if not
um,
impossible.
the problem is that my answer is going to sound kind of nonsensical, but I guess I'll say it anyway.
Right? Yeah.
It's rather
You
that
can answer in Flarf form if you'd like.
it's rather that I just don't. It's more like I guess a negative answer. It's just not trying to write against it,
Okay.
you know.
Sure, sure,
Um,
sure. Yeah.
but no, I don't find it especially inspiring.
Yeah.
They're definitely like beat poetry. I don't like at all, and I'm not trying to like write this poem so that I can convince people to stop writing beat poetry. Um, I would love it if they would, but I can't do anything about it.
But
And
there are also
so,
like there's snatches of things in beat poetry that I've found like, oh, I like that. But so yeah, like that
sure,
I
sure, sure.
yeah, yeah, but you can't write against against beat
No.
poetry. No.
Mm. And so that's, I'm not trying to fight against Flarf.
That seems right. I want to quickly give you an opportunity to, as I feel quite certain you will be, as I think I've gotten maybe one response agreeing with me, but otherwise it's been pretty universal agreement with Elijah in our conversation about typography, where I said, or I can't remember if it was Elijah or Cameron, but both of them disagreed with me
Okay.
about my sort of half serious dismissal of typography as being a sort of like a almost epiphenomenon of poetry,
Mm.
but because it seems to you as if like you use typography in a very robust way. So I even though you talked about composition in a kind of a like an unconscious fashion, it seems like you are like typography is important to you, and it seems to be that, yeah, in a way
Well,
that
what do you
might.
mean by typography? Let
I
me.
literally mean like the representation of the poem on the page, like all of the choices made that are not merely the words in order, right? Like how you
And you
punctuate them,
think
how you place them, how you space them, what slashes you put where, what.
that's not important?
I tend to see it as kind of an afterthought. Like
Mm.
I mean, I think because I do tend to write in regular meter and rhyme,
Mm.
to me the meter and the rhyme already determine sort of the true shape of the poem. Like the meter and the rhyme tell you where the lines are, they tell you where the stanzas are, and beyond that, and the grammar tells you where the punctuation is, more or less. And of course, like I do make choices. I do put some non-grammatical commas in. When I break lines against the meter, I will often do so just for the sake of trying to get published or just to kind of have fun with it. But
Mhm,
I
mhm,
tend to
mhm.
see all of that as being like as with like, from my perspective, the composition of a collection of poetry is a very ephemeral thing. Like the poems
Mhm.
individually are what survive. And I tend to think the the meter and the rhyme tell you the actual structure of the poem. And so whatever stuff you put on the page can be helpful or can be unhelpful, but is not really doesn't have the same level of reality. But as I said, everybody disagrees with me on that. So I assume you do, but I figured since you do kind of make muscular decisions with your typography, I thought I would give you a chance to tell me how wrong I am.
Sure. Not only do I disagree, I'm going to make a run at proving you wrong. So let's
Okay.
see what I can let's see what I can do about this. Okay. So here's the argument that I would make if I were trying to say not only are you wrong as a matter of opinion, but you are factually incorrect.
Okay.
Here's what I would say. So, as I think I touched upon a little bit when we talked about meter yesterday,
Mm-hmm.
and I talked about you scanning that line and that you put the Elijah in the right place, and I was like, you
Yeah, I did.
scanned it exactly right. So, over the centuries, editors of the works of canonical poets like Pope or whomever, partly because of, I suppose, reasons of typographical fashion, partly because they didn't fully understand what they were looking at, have tended to minimize or eliminate the apostrophes that indicated Elijans completely.
Yeah.
And so that you can find editions of poets who were relying on Elijans and relying on their contemporary understanding of Elijans to make their lines regular, and using apostrophes to indicate that use. You can find editions of these of poets that just don't have the apostrophes anymore. And so when you have a reader who is fully aware of the absence of these apostrophes, that reader can, in a sense, read the Elijans back into the line. If they've got a sensitive ear metrically and they understand what was there, it isn't there now, they can read them back in and see the regularity in the lines, even if it looks like it's an iambic pentameter line with like 14 syllables. And how are we accounting for these 14 syllables? The reader who's informed about these things can read those Elijans back in, sort of read the apostrophes back in, and they can make it regular as the poet intended it to be.
Right.
However, plenty of readers aren't aware of that stuff for a lot of cultural reasons, cultural and historical reasons. And we have gotten to a point, and probably have been here for some time, where younger readers who are very serious about poetry, who are very interested in meter, will look at these editions and not understand that this 14-syllable iambic pentameter line was considered regular. And they will think, oh, you can just substitute willy-nilly. You can fill in an anapest wherever you want, and it doesn't matter. It's still iambic pentameter. And in some sense, because we all agree, because the knowledge of what's happening in those lines is disappearing, in some sense, it becomes regular. The rule changes. But what ends up happening is they're just completely mistaken historically. They're not really reading what was there. And their own lines, in this historical sense, will be quote unquote incorrect, because they, even if they're trying to write with all their heart, they're like, I want to be a person who writes an iambic pentameter. I want Sir Philip Sidney to smile upon my works, when I stand next to him in heaven or whatever. And then, they think, oh, well, if I've got 3 anapests in it, it's still an iambic pentameter line.
Right. Yeah.
And so then when they go to heaven, Sidney's going to say, what are you talking about? I would not put 3 anapests in an iambic pentameter line. That's not iambic pentameter. So this is a typographical change that has a very serious and real impact upon the understanding of lines.
I was just reminded of the moment in I may have mentioned this at another point in it, but there's a moment in Kierkegaard's diaries where he just wrote a dialogue between Hegel and Socrates, where Hegel appears in the underworld and Socrates says, basically he says to him what Marshall McLuhan says in Annie Hall. He says, you know nothing of my work.
Yeah. Sure.
All right. No, I like that. So I can't remember, dilettante that I am, I cannot remember which is the okay, yeah, all right. So the Bailey is the castle. So in my bad faith Mott and Bailey argument, I'll now retreat to the Bailey or the small form, which is basically like, I think, in when I'm being obnoxious, I say typography doesn't matter or it's not real. The more conservative version of that argument is that typography is notation. That typography is like when a line is indented, that is actually has a correspondence to the meter of the poem, either because the line is continued or because it's a shorter line. When you hit return twice, all of these, and when you put in an apostrophe for an elision, all of these are notations of elements that are already present in the spoken or heard poem. So I think that's probably the less obnoxious version of my argument. But it seems, I would say that based on your poem's appearance, you probably have a stronger version of the typography matters argument. Even beyond that, I think pretty convincing proof, concluding with Sidney's disapproval in heaven.
I mean, I think that it's really interesting, actually, or it's not interesting because it's about my poetry. Who would say it's interesting? But I would say rather that, so I do a lot of Elijans and I don't ever mark them, and it's because I know that they're there. And so I'm going to kind of contradict myself violently here. I know that they're there, and I know that if I have to do like a quiz about it, I can point to where they are and I can explain the regularity of the line according to sort of historical standards.
You can justify yourself to Sidney.
Yeah, I can justify myself to Sidney. Believe it or not, the reason I probably pulled Sidney out of what seemed like thin air is because the defense of poetry is sort of like to me it's like a, you know, foundational critical English text, and I think of it as like, so I think of Sydney as like, I don't want to do anything metrically that Sydney would not have recognized as possible. And
Ah,
so that's how I tend to think about what I'm doing metrically.
okay. Okay. All right. All right.
And so yeah, I can justify myself to Sydney.
So you don't share all his moral views of how poetry should work, do you? I'm curious.
No, but I also can't. I mean, I can't really even remember them.
Okay.
I
All right.
think
Yeah.
about it. I think about it in a strictly technical sense.
Sure. 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 Sure.
I don't mark my elisions. I don't, you know, I don't try to make those things apparent. And I think that there's a way in which, by not doing that, if I assume that anybody has read any of my poems ever, then I am contributing to a problem that I decry, which is a sort of kind of metrical illiteracy. But
You're writing like it's like your poems are versions of the historical poems that have had the apostrophes removed,
yeah,
so that
they
when
just
people
never
read
have
them,
the
they will
apostrophes.
mistakenly think. I mean, though I would say probably a lot of people who read your poems might just mistakenly think they're free, like might not, we might fail to perceive the meter in the first
I
place.
think plenty of people think that they're free verse,
Yeah.
which is fine. You know, I don't mind it. When I was in Jory Graham's workshop and I started writing these poems, the poems that ended up being in Mule. Initially, I was writing, you know, just they were laid out in a very, you know, I would write a sonnet. It would have 14 lines, and each line would be an iambic pentameter. It would be rhyming, although the rhymes were irregular. They weren't like according to a pattern usually, but you know, they were laid out in a regular way. You know, iambic pentameter line, iambic pentameter line, iambic pentameter line, and then Jory said something in that class. She said she liked the poems. She was very kind about them, but she also said, you know, something to the effect of, "Is this tolerable over the course of an entire book?" Which filled me with a lot of angst and
Understood.
worry.
Yeah.
And so I was like, well, I've got to figure out how to do something else too. And so then I had this thought. It was, you know, is it possible to combine free verse and metrical verse into a single line, into a single poem? Can they operate simultaneously? And of course, the first thought is, well, of course not, because they are definitionally opposed. Like that's, you know, free verse takes its existence as I am not metrical verse, or it takes its existence from this idea. And so, but then it occurred to me that there was actually a way to do it. And that way, which you maybe have seen this in some of my poetry, the way to do it was you could use like virgules, you could use slashes to indicate where a rhyme goes, but then you could just keep writing past that on the page so that the line could be what counts in a metrical sense as a line and a half. But it's like you say that you kind of convert your poems to free verse.
Right.
This is sort of that same idea. So that if you break according to where the virgules are, you can see how it's laid out metrically, but you can write past that. You
Oh.
can write according to the year. And so that this was a way of combining metered verse and free verse into the same thing. And that led to very quickly a conception of a sonnet, for example, as something that wasn't just 14 lines in iambic pentameter. It was rather that a sonnet was a thing that was 14 lines and had 70 beats.
Right.
So, because that's what 5 times 14 is. So
Sure.
that some lines could have 7 beats, some lines could be, you know, 14ers, some lines could be trimeter. And as long as by the end of 14 lines, I got to 70 beats, that was a sonnet. That arose out of this idea that you could make free verse and metrical verse at the same time. I started to think
Okay.
of my forms in a kind of mathematical way,
It's like a slush
which,
fund.
yeah, which allowed me to think of a lot of different things. Like instead of rhyming, having each rhyme meet its pair in a single poem, mapping a whole book out and have the rhymes find their pairs over the course of a book in poems that were unrelated otherwise, things like
Gotcha.
that. It started to get me to think about form in a little bit in a freer way, even though
Yeah.
still in the unit of thinking about the unit of the foot and foot's related to each other, I still wanted Sydney to think it was okay. On the one hand, I worry a lot about metrical literacy, et cetera. On the other hand, I want the freedom and I want people to feel the freedom of sort of experimenting with all of this stuff. Um, and so, like, I do contribute to the decline of civilization by not marking my my Elijahs. But I also think it's important for poets to allow themselves freedom within the tradition according to which they think that they're working. This
Okay.
answer, this kind of flew out of this
No,
long-winded
no,
ramblings
but
kind of out of nowhere, but
I like that. And it actually reminds me of, and again, like as with so many things, my knowledge ends at the high school level, but I'm reminded of the distinction, which I'm sure I've misremembered, between plant and animal cells, which is that plant cells have hard cell walls and animal
hmm,
cells have cell membranes, and that on the cellular level, that would seem to be the case then that like plant cells were sort of stronger and hardier, but
hmm,
what that ends up meaning over the course of an entire organism is that animals are much more dynamic and powerful because they can move around.
sure,
They can shift those various prop, the quantity of stuff in them can be squished and stretched, whereas the
yeah,
plants they're stiff and brittle. No, I quite like that. Though, I mean, and I know you're sort of half tongue in cheek, but given that you tend to be pretty bullish about poetry and about development, if not progress, in the arts, I'm curious how tongue in cheek you're being when you talk about the decline of civilization or the like loss of this kind of knowledge.
artists have a tendency to sort of limit their options without really knowing that they're doing it. And I think that this
Mm,
has to do with a disinclination to engage with the history of the art that they're practicing. And I think that this is especially true with poetry. For a while, I wanted to be a composer and I wrote a lot of music. And if I had decided that I was going to be very, very, very serious about composition, I would have gone to a conservatory. And if I had gone to a conservatory, they would have tasked me with write an orchestral piece in the style of Mozart, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They would have given me an education that would have required me to know the history of the thing that I was trying to do. And that doesn't mean I know the history and I don't think that I can interrogate the history, but rather that I know what it is I'm interrogating. And I think that with poetry, especially, one feels disinclined to do that sort of study because as the result of a kind of paradoxical situation. On the one hand, of course, we're all taught that poetry is difficult. On the other hand, we have this sort of feeling, possibly almost instinctive, that because poetry is made out of words and we use words all the time,
yeah, yeah,
we should be able to just wake up and do it. And there's no reason that we would have to study it because
yeah.
we're it's like we're that whole I've been speaking prose my whole life.
Right.
You can just do it because you use words, and so you can do this difficult thing without ever having to study this difficult thing. Why I think that this means that poets especially are limiting their options. The more that you read, even of poets that you don't like or poets that you're ideologically opposed to. I don't like Walt Whitman's poetry, never have, but I've read
Yeah,
all of
sure.
it. Even the more that you read, the more freedom you grant yourself to write the next poem. The more you can take moves from that poet that you don't like. You can nonetheless recognize that they're doing something that you didn't know how to do before, and then that gives you a choice that you didn't have before. That allows you to incorporate their move into your own work. And so, if I contribute to younger poets, which again, to me, this is sort of fantastical because again,
Hmm.
I still am not and never have been convinced that anybody reads my poems. But if I contribute to younger poets thinking that an iambic pentameter line is X when I really believe it's Y,
Right.
and I'm just not marking the page in such a way that you can see that it's Y, then ultimately I'm limiting their options without really intending to. It might seem that I am giving them more freedom because turns out iambic pentameter is really, really, really very flexible. But from my perspective, if they read my lines in a sort of in that sort of way. From my perspective, it's the very strictness of the line that gives you freedom. It is tongue in cheek, but I also think as I said in the beginning of our conversation, I think that a poet, I was talking about myself, I guess, specifically, but I think a poet should know as much as they can, particularly about the art, because the more you know about it, the better poet you will be, and the better poems you will write. And the better poems you write, the more your poems are useful or pleasing to readers, useful to or pleasing to readers. And I think that I that's what I want poets to be aiming for. I want poets to know everything, and I want poets to know how an iambic pentameter line works. And I don't want to contribute to them having a shakier grasp of that.
But your poetry, its first job is to be a book of poems and not a primer. So you got
Yeah.
to, yeah. No, I think
Yeah.
that no, that makes good sense. Well, I'm going to have to go in a second, but I have one more very silly question from the Substack chat for you.
Mhm.
Austin asked, if you had to be stuck in an elevator with one poet, living or dead, who would you want it to be? Who would you least want it to be? And then Elijah asked, same question, but fist fight.
Well, I'm very, very serious about Jesus, so I wouldn't fist fight anybody.
All right.
I have no interest in that. Couldn't
Then
care
maybe you just
less.
pick someone you don't want to be, who you don't think could throw a punch very well. So you would rather not be punched very
So
hard.
most
Yeah.
poets.
Right. Yeah. I was going to say probably pretty safe. I call
Yeah. I would say
except
most
for
poets are fine.
except Sir Philip Sidney. You would not. Yeah.
Except for
Yeah.
maybe Sir Philip Sidney. Yeah.
Yeah.
What poet would I want to be in an elevator with? Most of them, I think, would probably. I mean, I don't want to be disabused of my fantasies about my heroes. Probably, honestly, and I mentioned him so much that I feel kind of bad about it because I've mentioned him to the exclusion. Oh, well, maybe Jay Wright.
Okay.
Um, maybe Jay Wright. I think he's brilliant, and in order to get that poem for the West Branch Online, he doesn't publish online.
Right.
And so, and he doesn't email, he doesn't do any of that stuff. I had to get his phone number from his publisher, and I called his wife. I didn't get to speak to Jay, but I got to
Right.
speak to his wife. And they let me publish a poem of his, which I'm grateful for forever. So maybe Jay Wright, maybe Jeffrey Hill, maybe Elizabeth Bishop. Let me think if there's anybody else. Maybe Sylvia Plath, because I owe so much to Sylvia Plath, although I don't know if it would be a stressful conversation.
Right.
It would be great to talk to Louise Glick. I don't see that. I mean, I've exchanged like 2 emails with her, but Louise Glick would be really high on that list. Any of those folks. Is there anybody else? Elizabeth Jennings would be cool. She's very interesting. I'm sure that there are others. Simone Weil, who did write poems with some seriousness, and a book of her poems is coming out this year, translations thereof. And I would love Simone Weil would be very, very high on my list of people I just want to talk to. So that's a good clump of a bunch of people, which means it's not exactly an answer. It's a lot of answers.
Any you would particularly avoid? I mean, I was gonna say, like, there's probably a pretty big list of poets. It's better to encounter on the page than in person.
Wallace Stevens would be one.
Right. Yeah. There's one.
I wouldn't want to meet Wallace Stevens. Let me think. Who else would I want to avoid?
I mean, there are plenty who,
I,
like, at various points would be in a bad state and
yeah,
not
yeah,
much
yeah. And I
fun.
think I'm
Yeah.
prepared for a lot of them. I think I have some vague sense of what Robert Lowell could be like.
Yes.
When
Yeah. You do.
he was in having a difficult time. But I think that the reasons I wouldn't want to hang out with Wallace Stevens is because I think he was who he was, and I
Right.
think
Yeah.
that that was just sort of you kind of get it all the time,
Yeah.
and so I don't think I want to hang out with him.